Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a really granular look at the Ottoman Empire during the 18th century.
Right.
This is a time frame that, it ought to get squeezed between the age of Sultanic conquest and the later 19th century Tanzimat reforms.
Sort of a flyover century for a lot of people.
Exactly. But it is precisely here, in what we call the Old Regime and the era of early reform, that the empire's internal contradictions really became fatal.
They really did.
Roughly spanning from 1700 to 1789, our source material paints this portrait of profound, almost tragic duality.
I think that's the perfect word for it, duality.
You have the unbelievable cultural brilliance of the famous Tulip era, juxtaposed with just catastrophic political and military failure, culminating in the foundational humiliation of the Treaty of Kusak-Kainarka.
It's a head-spinning century.
So our mission today is to uncover how a focus on internal peace and, luxury, really, paved the way for an existential geopolitical disaster.
It's the century where the Ottoman world successfully hit its head in the sand while its rivals were busy building cannons. I mean, if we use a single mental image to guide this deep dive, think of the 18th century Ottoman Empire as an aging, magnificent grand estate. It was built perfectly for the high summer of previous centuries, but now it's desperately trying to survive a freezing modern winter.
I like that, a grand estate in winter.
And the critical question for you, the listener, is how this period of luxurious, intense internal focus, the famous Leil d'Ivry, managed to lead directly, almost predictably, to the state's most profound existential crisis. A crisis engineered by its massive, modernizing northern neighbor, Russia. We really have to unpack the mechanism of that failure.
And the century begins not with a quiet adjustment or, slow decline, but with violent revolution. It just shows how unstable the foundations of that estate already were in 1703.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's unpack this starting crisis.
The year 1703 is crucial because it immediately establishes the pattern of systemic unrest that would define the entire century. We start not with a war against an external enemy, but with a massive, violent urban rebellion.
The Edirne event.
Exactly, the Edirne event.
Yeah.
And it was all focused on deposing Sultan Mustafa II.
And this wasn't just another Janissary coup, which, let's be honest, had been common enough throughout Ottoman history.
Not at all.
Our sources emphasize that the participation here was really broad. It was a coalition of unrest, involving not just the elite military corps, the Janissaries, but also students, lower-level administrative clerks, and prominent merchants.
And that is a crucial distinction. When you see Janissaries united with students from the madrasas, the religious schools, and the powerful Istanbul merchant guilds, it signals something much deeper.
It's a systemic dissatisfaction.
Deep, broad, systemic dissatisfaction. This was a crisis that transcended simple military pay disputes. This collective outrage successfully forced Sultan Mustafa II to abdicate in favor of his brother, Ahmed III. The Ottoman state, just 4 years into the new century, was already shaking violently from within.
So what was the driving trauma behind this internal upheaval?
Yeah.
It comes down to geopolitical reality, doesn't it?
That's it.
This event occurred just 4 years after the devastating Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699.
Precisely. To understand the mood of 1703, you absolutely have to remember Karlowitz. That treaty ended the Great Turkish War and forced the Ottomans to cede massive permanent territories. We're talking Hungary, large parts of Central Europe.
It must have been a shock.
It was an intellectual, political, and spiritual shock. The first major permanent territorial loss in centuries. The empire's self-image was shattered.
So the elite who survived Karlowitz and then this Edirne event had a singular, unified strategy moving forward. What was it?
Stability, first and foremost. Just stop the bleeding. They needed to stop the hemorrhaging of funds and credibility. The strategy was painfully clear. Stabilize the treasury, which meant they absolutely had to avoid costly European wars and drastically reduce state expenditures. They were entering the 18th century with a blueprint for fiscal recovery through peace.
A blueprint for peace.
That was the overarching strategic objective of the state.
But that blueprint for peace was immediately shredded. And this is where history gets genuinely interesting and a little absurd.
It really does.
Their quest for fiscal stability was derailed not by a planned invasion, but by an unlikely high-profile refugee crashing the diplomatic party.
The arrival of Charles XII of Sweden in 1709. The sheer geopolitical irony is staggering.
He was a big deal in Europe, right?
A titan in northern Europe, but he was just crushed by Peter the Great's Russia at the Battle of Poltava, so he flees directly south, seeking refuge and military assistance from the Sultan in Ottoman territory.
Wait, how did one defeated European monarch arriving as a guest manage to drag the entire empire into a war? What was the legal or political pretense there?
Well, his very presence was inherently destabilizing. It was bordering on a violation of sovereignty in Russia's eyes. And Charles wasn't just hiding out.
Yo.
He was actively lobbying the Ottoman court, trying to get them to aid his fight against Russia. And the Ottoman court, which, still held this deeply ingrained sense of imperial authority, couldn't just hand him over.
It would have been a sign of weakness.
A huge one. So this single act of hospitality was enough of a geopolitical complication to drag the Ottomans into a necessary conflict with Russia. All their carefully crafted desire for stability and reduced expenditure.
Out the window.
Instantly out the window. They were forced to fight the very war they had desperately sought to avoid.
And yet, despite acting against their own best interests, they did achieve a rare military success here. The victory at the Pruth River Campaign in 1711.
A vital, if highly deceptive, shot of confidence. The Ottoman forces, under the command of Baltaka Mehmet Pasha, managed to trap Peter the Great and the entire Russian army near the Pruth River.
They trapped the Tsar himself.
The Tsar himself. The Russians were effectively surrounded and starving. Peter the Great was forced to sue for peace, and the Ottomans managed to regain Azov, a crucial Black Sea port they had lost earlier.
So they beat the rising Russian power. That seems to contradict the whole narrative of decline we're setting up here.
And that's why it's the ultimate red herring of the early 18th century. It suggests that while the higher political structures were weakened and facing financial strain, the Ottoman military was still an effective, powerful fighting force.
So they could still win.
They could still win a major battle against a European army in the field, provided the conditions were right and the initial momentum was in their favor. But this temporary victory masked the deeper structural fragility. The state learned the wrong lesson.
Which was?
That they could still win by conventional means. This meant they prioritized stability and peace over necessary, costly, and frankly disruptive modernization.
So that victory, ironically, cemented the psychological conditions necessary for the next period, the famous Léo Tavri. It gave them the confidence to turn inward.
Exactly, to focus on internal recovery rather than continued military competition.
It established the pattern of prioritizing stability, which gave them the space, the gilded pause, you could call it, to indulge in the cultural flowering that defined the next decade.
But that space was an illusion built on an isolated, non-repeatable military success.
That brief military success didn't last, of course. They were soon dragged into another conflict, ultimately leading to the Treaty of Passarowitz in 1718, where they lost more territory to the Habsburgs.
Right, more losses.
But following that treaty, they finally secured that desired span of sustained peace and relative prosperity. This is the moment the empire shifts its vision inward under Sultan Ahmed III and his Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damad Barbrahim Pasha.
The Léo Tavri, the Tulip era. The tulip, which was traditionally associated with wealth and beauty in Ottoman culture, became the defining symbol of this period.
A symbol of a peaceful reign.
Exactly, focused on refinement and luxury rather than military conquest. It was a cultural obsession that penetrated all levels of the elite.
What specifically distinguished this cultural flourishing from previous periods? It sounds like more than just planting pretty gardens.
Oh, much more. It was defined by two things. First, an unprecedented openness to European cultural forms, but, and this is key, a non-military opening.
Okay.
And second, an explosion of public works and a real shift in aesthetic sensibility. We see the clear adoption of Baroque and Rococo styles in architecture.
Styles that previously would have been viewed with suspicion given their European Christian origins.
Absolutely.
Can you give us a concrete example of this Baroque influence? How did it manifest architecturally?
Well, think of the Sadabad Palace complex built on the Golden Horn. It was a series of lavish kiosks, gardens, pleasure pavilions, all built in the French style. These structures were light, intricate, and dedicated entirely to leisure and spectacle.
So a radical departure from the heavy, monumental, austere, classical Ottoman architecture of earlier centuries.
A complete departure. It was a conscious effort to mimic and perhaps even surpass the courts of Versailles or Vienna. It really demonstrates a new cosmopolitan spirit among the elite.
So, returning to our grand estate analogy, this was the moment the family decided to stop worrying about the structural repairs to the foundation or the defense systems.
Right.
And instead spent their savings on elaborate indoor renovations, garden parties, and exquisite new fountains.
That's it, exactly. They were creating a beautiful cosmopolitan bubble to forget the territorial losses and the freezing winter raging outside the geopolitical gates.
But it wasn't just parties and palaces, was it?
No, not at all. This era saw a genuine emphasis on intellectual and urban improvement. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, was a key patron of the arts and sciences. He sponsored translations and actively encouraged the study of European advancements, particularly in cartography and medicine.
So there was a clear, calculated attempt to absorb useful knowledge from the West.
Yes, provided it didn't challenge the core religious or military structures.
And this leads us to the single most important technological milestone of the era, one that promised genuine, scalable modernization, but again was handled with immense caution.
You're talking about the printing press.
The establishment of the first Turkish printing press.
Absolutely pivotal for long-term intellectual development. A man named Ibrahim Müteferrika, a Hungarian convert and diplomat, managed to establish the press in 1727. This was revolutionary. It signaled the state's recognition that mass production of knowledge was essential for catching up with Europe.
But the establishment of the press was a masterclass in compromise, wasn't it? It just highlights the fierce tension between these reformist impulses and the established conservative power base.
Especially the ulema, the religious learned men.
Yeah.
It was a bureaucratic negotiation that spanned years. The ulema were immensely powerful, essentially the guardians of the established socio-religious order, and they were profoundly suspicious of the printing press.
What were they afraid of, specifically?
Two things, really. On a practical level, job loss for the thousands of scribes who manually copied texts for a living.
Okay, an economic concern.
But far more seriously, they feared the mass production and possible unauthorized standardization or, in their eyes, corruption of religious texts, particularly the Quran and its commentaries.
So what was the compromise that Müteferrika had to strike to get the necessary official authorization?
To appease these powerful conservative forces and gain the Sultan's firman, or decree, the press was initially restricted to publishing only non-religious works.
Only non-religious.
We are talking history, geography, science, technical manuals, the exact type of texts the reformists believed were necessary for administrative and military recovery. Critically, printing religious texts was explicitly banned. That left the domain of the sacred firmly in the hands of the conservative scribes and the ulema.
That distinction is just fascinating. It shows that the state could support technical modernization, but only if it didn't challenge deeply entrenched religious authority.
Or the economic interests connected to that authority.
Right.
It provides the perfect microcosm of the Tulip era. You have this cosmopolitan elite enjoying Baroque architecture, reading new atlases and histories, published on a printing press, engaging with European ideas of leisure and refinement.
But at the same time.
But simultaneously, the fundamental structure of the military remains outdated, and the influence of the conservative religious elite remains completely static. They successfully throttled the most revolutionary aspect of the press, its ability to disseminate ideas broadly.
So it was a golden decade resting on a truly fragile foundation.
A foundation of cultural spectacle divorced from structural necessity.
A stunning cultural moment, but one that perhaps only underlined the ultimate fragility of the empire.
And, inevitably, the bubble burst. That beautiful gilded pause of the Tulip era was violently and decisively ended just 12 years after it began.
By the Petronihillo Revolt in 1730.
Exactly. And the speed and the brutality of the backlash demonstrate just how thin that layer of cosmopolitan reform truly was.
The causes sound like a classic revolutionary recipe. We have perceived decadence at home clashing with military failure abroad. Can you detail the combination that proved so combustible? Well, the court's conspicuous, almost shocking extravagance. Tulips, the competitive, elaborate tulip festivals, the expensive new palaces, all of it generated profound public resentment. The Sultan and his vizier were viewed as frivolous and detached.
And that resentment became dangerous when combined with military setbacks.
Specifically, ongoing, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful wars with Persia in the East. Losses meant expenses, expenses meant new taxes, and new taxes, when combined with images of the elite throwing lavish garden parties,
Instantly ignite instability.
It's a perfect storm.
So when the perception of wasteful luxury among the elite clashed with blood and treasure being spent pointlessly on the frontier, the spark of rebellion ignited easily. And who was the face of this bloody urban uprising?
Petronihillo. He's identified in our sources as a Janissary, a low-ranking officer.
And crucially, an Albanian who had worked as a bath attendant. Yes, his profile highlights the populist nature of the uprising. He was not a member of the established military or political elite. He was a man of the people, so to speak.
And this revolt brought together the same elements of collective dissatisfaction we saw in the Yaduran event of 1703. But this time, the Janissaries, now under populist leadership, were the driving force.
They were the vehicle for the conservative backlash. The revolt was absolutely brutal. It targeted everything associated with the Tulip era's opulence.
The palaces.
Kiosks and pleasure palaces, including the famous Sadabad complex, were sacked and destroyed. It forced Ahmed III to abdicate. His Grand Vizier, Nevşehirli Damad Ibrahim Pasha, the very architect of the Gilded Paws, was executed.
A violent end to a peaceful era.
A very violent end. The Sultan was replaced by Mahmud I.
This raises a critical question that really haunts the rest of the century. Why the violence? Why did the Janissaries, a military body, become the primary obstacle to both cultural and eventually military reform? What had happened to their institutional discipline?
Well, this requires a deeper look into the systemic breakdown of the Janissary Corps in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Janissaries had moved from being the elite, centrally controlled slave soldier infantry corps
to becoming a self-preserving guild.
That's the perfect way to put it. By the 18th century, the old rules against marriage and against enrolling their children in the corps had long been ignored.
So the corps became hereditary.
Precisely. It became a hereditary privileged class. Enrolling your son was a way to secure tax exemptions and access to powerful patronage networks.
So they weren't professional soldiers anymore.
Many weren't. They weren't spending time in barracks or training. They were often merchants, artisans, or shopkeepers who simply collected a state salary and wielded immense political power through their association with the corps.
They had become an economic interest group that just happened to wear a military uniform.
Yes. So when the reformist Grand Vizier began spending money on tulips and palaces rather than focusing on military salaries or, God forbid, potentially reforming the court itself,
he threatened their status.
He threatened their entrenched position. The Janissaries, having demonstrated indiscipline and political rebelliousness for decades, reestablished a conservative, military-focused government in 1730.
They violently shut down that brief flirtation with peaceful, cosmopolitan culture.
Because it distracted from their institutional primacy, and more importantly, because Europeanization always carried the threat of military modernization, which would expose their obsolescence and force the dissolution of their corrupt patronage system.
The memory of this Patrona Halil backlash effectively inoculated the Ottoman elite against any serious, significant European-style reform for the next several decades.
It became a powerful, bloody warning. Attempt genuine modernization, and you risk a violent overthrow and execution.
And the result was this famous period of internal stability from roughly 1740 to 1768, which the Ottomans desperately desired.
But stability built on fear and inertia is not the same as strength. It left the empire catastrophically unprepared for the emerging threat that was consolidating power and modernizing rapidly in the east.
While the Ottoman elite was nervously rebuilding its palace after the riot, fearing the next Janissary uprising,
the real enemy was building a modern navy and charting a course for the Black Sea.
The contrast between the Ottoman Empire and Russia at mid-century is stark, almost heartbreaking.
It really is. While the Ottomans prioritized that internal stability, that gilded pause, from 1740 to 1768, Russia, under Catherine the Great, was undergoing profound institutional and military modernization.
And aggressively pursuing strategic expansionist goals.
Yes. Catherine the Great's ambition centered on two critical objectives: gaining a warm water port on the Black Sea and achieving unfettered access to the Mediterranean Sea via the Strait.
Which meant challenging Ottoman dominance in the Crimea and along the northern Black Sea coast. A direct threat.
A direct existential threat.
The Ottoman stability was built on inertia, and inertia, in military terms, translates directly into obsolescence. They were standing still while their enemy was moving at pace. What was the state of the Ottoman military in the 1760s compared to Russia's?
This is the crux of the disaster. The Ottoman military establishment, dominated by those self-preserving Janissaries, had largely failed to adopt European military innovations dating back to the 17th century, let alone the 18th.
They were still fighting the old way.
Relying on traditional, large-scale cavalry forces and siege tactics.
What specifically were they missing that the Russians possessed?
Well, the Russians had embraced modern field artillery. We're talking faster firing, lighter, and more mobile cannon that could be integrated directly into infantry formations.
And the Ottomans.
Still reliant on heavy, slow-to-move siege guns and massed infantry attacks, tactics that were completely ineffective against disciplined European lines supported by modern firepower.
And there was another problem, wasn't there? The long peace.
A huge problem. The Ottomans had ceased conducting large-scale military exercises during that long peace. The Janissaries had become ceremonial soldiers, completely unaccustomed to modern warfare.
And the moment of reckoning came in 1768.
It did. Sultan Mustafa III, despite this clear technological chasm, made the fateful, unwise decision to declare war on Russia following a border incident at Balta.
Why? Why would he do that?
Historians argue he was provoked, perhaps by Crimean Khanate incursions, but the underlying reason was likely an overestimation of the lingering Ottoman power. He was probably still thinking about that temporary victory at Pruth decades earlier.
This decision is such a sharp, painful contrast to the cautious, peace-seeking posture they adopted after Karlowitz in 1699.
It is.
They entered a war they couldn't possibly win based on technology.
They were severely misjudging their preparedness. Our sources document that the Ottoman army and navy were effectively 3 centuries behind their rivals in technological capability. That peace from 1740 to 1768, which was intended to aid financial stability.
It actually doomed them.
It functioned as the crucial lag time that ensured their defeat. By declaring war in 1768, they confirmed that the inertia of the Janissary-dominated system had doomed them.
The result was nothing short of a strategic catastrophe, epitomized by the Battle of Chesme in 1770. This was the crushing blow to Ottoman naval power.
Chesme is one of the most defining moments of the 18th century. It demonstrated not just a technological gap, but a massive logistical and operational chasm.
Right.
I mean, think about the audacity of the Russian action. Their Baltic fleet, the fleet from the cold north, sailed completely around the entirety of Europe. Through the Atlantic, past the Straits of Gibraltar, and into the Aegean Sea to confront the Ottomans in their own home waters.
The sheer logistical feat of sailing a military fleet halfway around the world into hostile territory is immense. It speaks volumes about the naval capability Catherine the Great commanded.
It does, and the Ottoman response was fatally outdated. They were primarily fighting with large, unwieldy ships of the line, often poorly maintained and crewed by sailors who lacked modern training.
So what happened at Chesme?
The Russian ships, which were often smaller but more maneuverable and carried more accurate, faster-firing cannons, trapped the entire Ottoman fleet in the bay. Then they used fire shifts, a traditional tactic, but executed with modern precision, and achieved total destruction.
Total destruction. How devastating was the loss psychologically and strategically?
The Ottoman Navy was almost completely annihilated. We're talking upwards of 15,000 sailors killed or captured, dozens of major vessels lost. This event was psychologically and strategically traumatic for the entire Ottoman world.
I can only imagine.
For centuries, Ottoman naval supremacy had been a given in the Mediterranean Black Sea. This disaster confirmed that the age of undisputed power was definitively over. It not only provided an immense morale boost for the expanding Russian Empire,
but it signaled to all of Europe that the Ottoman Empire was now a paper tiger.
Exactly. Vulnerable even in its own backyard.
The aging Grand Estate's defenses, the walls facing the sea, had been utterly demolished in front of the entire world, clearing the way for the ultimate humiliation in 1774.
The war on land concluded with the final, decisive defeat of the Ottoman forces at the Battle of Kozlutza. After that, the Ottomans had no choice. They had to sue for peace.
Which led directly to the signing of the Treaty of Kusa-Kinarka in 1774.
Yes. And this treaty is not just a peace agreement. It is the absolute milestone in the empire's decline and the single most damaging political document of the 18th century.
You can measure the rapid collapse of Ottoman power across the century by just tracking those two treaties. Karlowitz in 1699, which forced them to cede Central Europe, and now Kusa-Kinarka, which fundamentally broke their sovereignty and opened the door to Russian domination of the Black Sea. What was the most immediate, concrete loss?
The loss of the Crimean Khanate. The treaty stipulated that the Khanate was to be declared independent. Independent, of course, being a thinly veiled stepping stone to Russian annexation, which occurred less than a decade later.
Can you detail the significance of Crimea's independence? Because it was far more than just losing a strategic peninsula.
It was a profound shock on multiple levels. Politically, this was the first time in Ottoman history that a Muslim-majority territory, a territory ruled by one of the empire's most important Sunni vassal houses, slipped entirely from the Sultan's political control.
It proved the empire could no longer guarantee the protection of its Muslim subjects.
Exactly.
But our sources mention a crucial spiritual element that was retained. This has massive implications for future Ottoman policy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Though the Sultan lost political control over Crimea, the treaty stipulated that he retained his role as the spiritual leader, or caliph, over the Crimean Tatars.
And by extension, other Muslims now under foreign rule.
Yes. And this separation of political authority, now lost, and spiritual authority, now retained and codified in an international treaty, becomes a foundational element of later Ottoman foreign policy. It was a strategic effort to retain some degree of influence over Muslims outside their shrinking political borders.
So the Sultan's claim to the caliphate transformed from an internal traditional title into an active codified tool of soft power.
It becomes a foreign policy tool.
Used to maintain influence even when the political writ had run out. This is where the modern conception of the caliphate really takes hold.
Precisely. It was a desperate attempt to salvage religious legitimacy from political defeat, something that would resonate throughout the Muslim world for the next century and a half.
But the truly insidious, and perhaps most devastating, part of Kusuk Kainarka, the clause that fundamentally broke Ottoman sovereignty, was the rights Russia gained within the Ottoman heartland itself.
Right, specifically related to the empire's Orthodox Christian subjects.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this treaty didn't just end a war. It established the legal foundation for permanent European interference in Ottoman domestic affairs. It basically stabilized and defined their decline.
It did. Russia gained two key rights here. First, a symbolic but important right: permission to construct an Orthodox church in Istanbul.
A physical religious foothold right in the imperial capital.
Yes. But second, and infinitely more damaging, Russia claimed and secured the formal role of protector of the Sultan's Orthodox Christian subjects, particularly in the Danubian principalities.
That sounds less like a protective role and more like a legal invitation for political manipulation.
It was exactly that. This provision, vague enough to be interpreted broadly, granted Russia a permanent legal excuse to interfere in Ottoman domestic affairs whenever they wished.
So any grievance, real or invented,
related to the treatment of Orthodox Christians, Russia could invoke the treaty to apply military or diplomatic pressure. This single provision crystallized what history would later call the Eastern Question,
a century-long geopolitical problem.
Driven primarily by Russian imperialism toward the declining Ottoman state, using minority protection as its legal leverage.
So the internal religious and ethnic structure of the empire was now formally placed under the strategic control of a hostile foreign power. This is the moment they lost genuine internal sovereignty.
Absolutely. To return to our analogy,
The Grand Estate.
this was the moment the Ottomans were forced to sign away the back half of their yard, Crimea, and worse, give the massive new neighbor Russia the key to their front door.
The right to walk in and inspect the house.
Whenever they claimed the servants, the Orthodox Christians, were being mistreated, the status reversal was complete. The Ottoman Empire was now negotiating for its survival, not its expansion.
And the damage wasn't contained. The rapid erosion following Kainarka confirms the new reality. We see conflict erupt again just 13 years later in 1787.
Yes, the Russo-Turkish War of 1787-1792. That war, which also involved Austria, further exhausted the already defeated Ottoman forces, and the subsequent Treaty of Jassy in 1792 confirmed and expanded the damage done by Kainarka.
How so?
It allowed Russia to officially expand its territories further along the northern shores of the Black Sea and solidify its dominance there. The existential threat that began with Charles XII's arrival and was formalized by Kainarka was now geographically anchored on the Black Sea coast.
It seems like Kainarka wasn't just a treaty. It was a permanent, structural diagnosis of the Ottoman Empire as a failing state, dependent on the whims of its powerful neighbors.
The century closes, almost fittingly, in the year of the French Revolution, with the accession of a new sultan, Selim III, in 1789.
And by this point, the political and financial diagnosis was beyond dispute. The empire was facing total collapse.
The time for tulip parties and ignoring the military TASM was definitively over.
Selim III is significant because he finally understood that the state could not survive unless it abandoned the old ways and modernized along European lines.
Not just cosmetically, but structurally. especially militarily.
He had seen the proof in the smoldering ruins of the Ottoman fleet at Chesme and the devastating terms of Küçükçinarka.
He knew that adopting the European system was the only way to avoid being completely dismembered.
And this led to his most famous and most challenging endeavor, the introduction of the Nizam seated.
The Nizam seated, which means new order or new army. This was the first truly serious, organized attempt to build a modern military force designed and trained to fight European armies on their own terms.
Using modern artillery, small arms, tactical drilling methods.
It was not merely improving the Janissaries, it was creating a parallel military structure designed to bypass and eventually replace the obsolete Old Guard.
But this effort, this necessary attempt to save the state from total collapse, immediately faced a familiar, violent, and highly entrenched opposition.
The entrenched Janissary Corps, the very same military body that had led the Patrona Halil revolt to violently shut down cultural reform in 1730,
was now prepared to violently resist military reform in 1789 and the decades that followed.
We are seeing this cyclical tragedy play out again, but this time the stakes are ultimate. The military force, whose sole purpose was supposedly to defend the empire, was actively sabotaging the empire's only chance for survival.
Because the reform threatened their patronage networks and privileged status.
It is the defining irony of the 18th century. The empire proved it could innovate, culturally embracing the printing press, Baroque architecture, new arts, but it fundamentally failed to integrate the necessary military and political technology.
Right.
Every single time a serious structural reform was proposed, whether cultural or military, it was violently resisted by the entrenched military and conservative elite who prioritized their own institutional survival and power over the survival of the state itself. The inertia was just too strong.
That dynamic of internal institutional inertia ensuring external collapse is the most profound and challenging legacy of this entire century. They couldn't be beaten until they beat themselves first.
It raises the ultimate question for any institution facing transformation. When the very forces sworn to protect the state become the agents of its stagnation and subsequent collapse, when the old guard's self-preservation mechanism prioritizes its own existence over the viability of the whole, is that decline truly inevitable?
A powerful question.
It's a powerful lesson about the fragility of power and the cost of resisting change.
A deeply complex century defined by the tulip's brief beauty and the czar's permanent shadow. Thank you for guiding us through this deep dive.